Okay guys, so this video is over community ecology. It is the penultimate video for you in AP Bio. This is the one before the last. So there's one more video of notes after this and never again. I know you're excited. So we're talking about community ecology. There's a little bit of math. It's a little bit of a new concept. But we will go through and we'll make it make sense. So here we go. So when we use the word community in biology, we're not just talking about one individual group of species. We're talking about all of the species that live in an area and the physical location of where they live as well. So we can measure and describe a community in terms of the species composition, so who all is present, and then also the species diversity, how many different kinds of species we have. So again, species composition is going to be all of the species that make up that community or that location. And your species diversity is the richness of the species. So in other words, the number of different types of species and how many of them we have. So their relative abundance. Right, so there you have some quick notes to kind of make some of that make a little bit more sense. So let's look at this image really quick. Let me switch to my laser. So this entire area is going to be our community. We're looking at a community of different kinds of plants or trees. Now, notice we are looking at the entire area. So we can talk about all of the individual species. So these guys would be all the same species. These guys are a different species. So that's 2 so far. These are a different, that's 3. And these are a different, so that's 4. So we can talk about having 4 different species of trees within this location that makes up our community. Now, when we look at the numbers, there are 4 species, and there's an even spread of those 4 species. So about 25% of that community's population is made up of species A, B, C, and D. If we look at community 2, right away we can see that looks slightly different. So we have all of the same species represented, A, B, C, and D, but they're represented in different amounts. So we only have 1 of species C. We also have 1 of species B. We have 2 of species D, and then several of species A. So again, a different composition of the same set of species. These 2 communities would have a different measurement for their community richness and their relative abundance. So there is a measurement for that. It is called Simpsons Diversity Index, and the formula is written for you here. I'm going to box it to make it easy to find. So let's talk about what these different parts mean. Now, you know what 1 is. So 1 minus the summation of. So we know what sum is, so that part's easy. It's this part in the middle that sometimes gets tricky, and honestly, it's not hard. It's a very simple math procedure. It's just a matter of you knowing what the different variables stand for. So little n is going to represent the total number of organisms of a particular species. So just species A, how many species A organisms do I have? Capital N is going to represent the total number of organisms of all the species. So in my area, I have 4 different species. I have a total of 100 individuals. That would be my number N. So you would do your division, and notice it says summation. So literally you would do this calculation for every species you had. So if you had 4 species, different species, you would do this calculation for each one of them that's represented. We do have an example coming, so don't worry about that too much. Now, this part of our equation, the summation times 2, this is going to calculate the probability that 2 species selected from the same community will be the same. They'll be part of the same group. So I randomly close my eyes and I grab an organism from part A of my community and part B of my community, or from the north of the community to the south of the community. That number is going to represent the chances that the 2 creatures, the 2 plants, the 2 whatever I just grabbed are going to be from the exact same species. Now, generally, the lower this number, the higher the diversity. So the lower your Simpsons index, the more indicative of a high diversity for that community. Lots of different species there. So again, this is your full equation. Now, once you work out that final number, the higher the number, the more diversity, because you're looking at the probability that they won't be the same species. Okay, so I know that sounds a little weird, but remember, I'm going to switch to my laser pointer. When I talked about this part, I was only talking about a small section of the formula. So the lower this individual number, the higher the diversity. But when we frame it in terms of the entire formula, including that 1 minus, that's when we're talking about the entire community, not just the individual species, but the whole community together. So the higher the entire result, the more diversity, because we're looking at the probability that these animals or these plants or these insects won't actually be part of the same species. Now, your probabilities are always going to be between, 0 and 1, which means that your answer to the Simpsons diversity index should also be between 0 and 1, so it should be a decimal. If you get something bigger than 1, you've made a mistake somewhere, and you're going to have to go back and fix that. Okay, so let's look at an example, because again, it's sounding way more complicated than it actually is. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write out the formula. Okay, so here's your formula. Now, thanks to the wonders of trying to put a Google slide and its formatting, we had specialness when it converted. So these are really to the power of 2. It's not just times 2. I might have said times 2 earlier. I meant to the power of 2. Okay, so in this picture, we have 5 different species. Let's just pretend we have 5 different species in this picture. So what you would do as the scientist, as the ecologist, is you would identify all of the species present, and then you would sit down and you would count them. So let's say species 1 was the zebra, species 2 was the giraffe, species 3 were the lions. You would sit and count how many giraffes I see, how many lions do I see, how many hyenas do I see, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you would put all of that into a table format. So we're pretending that this picture represents this table exactly. So we had 65 individuals in species 1, 42 in species 2, 93 in species 3, 15 in species 4, and 31 in species 5. So remember, little n represents the total number of organisms in a particular species. So that would be these numbers. So this is your little n, all the way down, okay? Capital N represents the total number of organisms of all the species present. So if we added all of these individual species numbers, then capital N would be equal to 246. So then species by species, you would set up your Simpsons index. So this would be species 1, which is 65 divided by 246, all raised to the power of 2. Species 2 would be 42 divided by 246, all raised to the power of 2. And hopefully by now you're getting the concept. So this would be species 3, here is 4, and here is 5. But because it is a summation, we're actually going to take the result of those individual calculations and add them together. So if you were to do this really quick, the result of the entire formula would be 0.7385, give or take a number or two. Now, if we broke it down and we looked at just what the summation is equal to, so the summation part itself of little n over big N, all raised to the power of 2, is actually equal to 0.2615. How did I get that? I got that by just adding these parts together, okay? Not doing the 1 minus, just working out 65 over 246 raised to the power of 2 plus 42 over 246 raised to the power of 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? So if I were to turn that decimal into a percentage, because remember that technically is a percentage, what we're saying is that there's a 26.15% chance that two species would be the same if we just randomly grabbed them. Okay? Now, overall, it means that species with a higher diversity index tend to be more stable. The more diverse the population, the more stable, for the most part, the population, because everyone's fulfilling a different role, a different job, a different niche, and they're all occupying a slightly different habitat to the species next to them. Okay? So the higher the diversity index, the more stable that population is overall. So how do communities change? Community change is going to be based on population interactions, how different groups interact and behave within the area that they live in. And this really boils down to how these organisms are going to access energy and how they access matter within their area that they're found in, within their community. So, of course, we can talk about positive and negative interactions. Some examples that jump to mind right off the bat are things like predator-prey relationships, trophic cascades, and niche partitioning. And we'll talk a little bit more detail coming up. For graphs that represent community change, expect to see at least two sets of lines or variables happening, because you're always looking at how one thing is affecting another. So let's start with trophic cascades. So a trophic cascade is an indirect interaction that can control or alter lots of individuals within the ecosystem. And it happens when a trophic level in a food web is suppressed or controlled. So if I eliminate my topmost predator, what happens to the levels underneath that predator? Or if I eliminate a primary consumer, what happens to the levels in between? So it's what happens when one part of our food web greatly affects everything within that food web without having a direct result or a direct interaction, to those organisms. There is a video that goes through how removing wolves from Yellowstone affected the overall population, and it's a great example of trophic cascades. So think of it as, I've eliminated my top predator, pretty much everyone starts running amok. We're going to have a lot more of our prey items, but not just our big prey, our small prey as well, which means that they're going to have an even bigger cost, or they're going to exert a bigger cost, on the ecosystem. So think needs increase. I'm going to need more space. I'm going to need more shelter, more water, more food. Okay, so that's what trophic cascades are. Then there's niche partitioning. So a niche or a niche is an organism's role or job in the ecosystem. And that includes every single thing about that organism, from what resources they use or need, and if two organisms occupy the same niche, then we have a loss of resources. So naturally, organisms do not occupy the same niche. They will always adjust or move around so that they are pulling on different resources, because your area, your ecosystem cannot sustain lots and lots of individuals all eating or drinking or living at exactly the same level. So what this does is it allows for similar organisms to still exist in the same community, but they divide the niche. So I use the top part, you use the bottom part. That way everyone's happy. Another way to think of it is, I could be active during the day when you're active at night. So we're occupying different niches. Or maybe I live up in the canopy in the trees, but you live down in the roots of the tree. So because we're in different locations, we have access to different resources, still the same needs, but they're being met by different resources. Okay, so some other examples of population dynamics or interactions are competition. So we have intraspecific competition, where you have individuals who are part of the same species competing with each other. So think mate, for example. Then we have interspecific competition, where individuals from different species are competing with each other. So think more resource type stuff like food or water or shelter. Okay, then we also have things like predation. Okay, that one should be obvious. I'm going to go ahead and eat you because you are my food source. I think I have another slide, so hold on. Okay, this one you probably remember from freshman year because it tends to be one that you guys hang on to fairly well, and it's the concept of symbiosis. So sim means together and bio means life. So literally we're talking about a life together. And there are 3 levels to symbiosis. So there's mutualism, where everyone benefits. So the example here is that bee with the flower. The bee is the pollinator. That way the flower can continue to produce offspring, and the flower is producing a food source for the bee. So everyone's happy, everyone benefits. Then there's commensalism, where there is an active benefit for one member of the party, and the other party isn't harmed, but they're not benefiting. Think of it as they are unaffected. And then lastly, we have parasitism. Okay, so with parasitism, that one again is kind of self-explanatory. I am actively using you as my food source. Now, the difference between parasitism and prey, with prey, the predator sets out to kill and eat that organism for food. With parasitism, the parasite is living off of its host, but the goal is not to kill the host because that's a little counterintuitive. Now I got to find a new host. Does the host sometimes die? It sure does. However, the difference is the intent. The parasite doesn't intend to kill its host. That sometimes is a byproduct of the circumstance. Whereas with prey, the predator sets out to actively kill and consume said prey. Okay, so the last population dynamic we're going to talk about is cooperation and coordination. You see this especially in organisms that live as part of big groups, so think schools or flocks. And it's all about enhancing the experience of the individual organism through the behavior of the masses. So it can be used to enhance movement or to access matter or energy. So think of ducks as they migrate. That lead duck for a period of time, or geese, all birds to be honest, that lead bird for a period of time is going to be the one cutting through the air resistance, making flight super easy for all of the ducks that fall behind. Now, that lead duck isn't going to be lead duck the entire time. They will rotate out and everybody takes a turn and everybody helps the greater good of the entire group. We can think of mammals and how they protect each other when they're in their pods. Dolphins are an amazing example of this. When a dolphin is giving birth, the entire pod corrals and protects that individual until the baby is born, and it shows all signs that that baby will survive. So they will fend off attacks. They will help mom to stay swimming and active in the water. They will help push baby up so baby can take its first breath. All of the things necessary for that mother to have a successful birth, that pod is going to help with. We can think about wild dogs and how they hunt as a pack. No one dog might be capable of taking down a large prey item, but all together, they're going to be able to do that. And then, of course, we watched that video of ants building rafts to protect their queen and the babies as the area that they live in floods. All right, so this is it. I know this one was a little bit longer because I did a lot of examples, but I really hope that it makes sense. So I'll talk to y'all soon. Bye, guys.